The Confederates' war crimes by their hate group engaged in insurrection by their double agents, targeting key facets of the United States, such as David and the other American elites, who were targeted to be reduced in value against the Constitution in every violation of law by the Confederacy, which claims that their spells cannot have a remedy, and thus the presumption that the law does not exist is the status quo engagement as their function, and the United States, therefore, as a government, is their enemy in war, making them self labeled as enemy combatants, such as is defined by Lindsey Graham, which self identified him as supporting the Confederacy in the overthrow of the American government, which, having conducted this terrorism, conducts censorship and editing for simulations, which alters the free market, which is owed by law, into the communist market for the white supremacists, which they have generated, removing the speech, such as David specifically citing his forming of his political party, which also includes his party's specified National News Corporation, as well as the political social media structure labeled by the Twitter files uh, generators as a complete nullification of their ability to acquire their agenda of the fascist overthrow of the United States by the use of the controlled narratives through the censorship campaigns orchestrated by the Confederate insurgents in the government, ordering the public private partnership so that they can conduct the military operation PSYOPs against the United States in this mechanism by the systemic voter fraud and insurrection, which is naturally generated by the byproduct, the obstruction of the contracts stops the money, and money, according to the Supreme Court, is speech. And thus, the mechanism of censorship by the stopping of the contracts of the work is censorship of the speech and the censorship of self determination, the pursuit of your own uh, interest and your own happiness, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All of it is in the trash bin by the white supremacists, KKK, inside the government through William Barr's uh, support of Confederate insurrection as the functional position of his insurrectionist objectives is double agents in the government conducting substantive changes to the market for voter fraud, which has been certified as an objective, at which point the crafted changes to the United States has allowed the Confederates to completely ignore the American government and its laws, and thus the mechanism of insurrection by the definition of the prohibition by law is the definition of their objectives of violation in order to acquire what is legally prohibited by their de facto practices of sedition, such as their targeting of David Bowles, who is the primary leader of the American mechanisms of enforcement against them, and thus the sedition, having blocked the law enforcement, creates the de facto policies in the white supremacist communism, substantively changing through criminal revolution and the psychotic revolutionaries, following procedures of the Terror Factory and the protocols of the Learned Design in its entirety, generating the collapse by their pursuit of the various mechanisms, such as their creation of the artificial Pokemon into real life, where Pokemon are actual people who are being trafficked, as well as the function mechanism of creating alterations such as D&D, which forms their criminal strategies according to these games and mechanisms, making them viable campaigns against the United States civilian population and its government by the engagement of the crimes according to those specific limitations so that they, entertaining themselves, can have fun while ruining the United States and the planet. The rapists, having mechanized their systemic racism, having overcome the United States by the Confederate powers, such as Jeffrey Epstein and Jay Sekulow, amongst the other mechanisms, have substantively changed the policies, such as in California, where the surveillance tampering is specifically prohibited from being uh, dealt with by the courts by obstruction of justice and contempt for court on purpose, which has double agent judges which are in on the con, specifically accelerating weapons of mass destruction, as the weapon of mass destruction generated by the fraudulent codes generates predetermined guilt, structures of the innocent, nullifying the right of the presumption of innocence in all causes, at which point the parties being abused and coerced upon the admission of innocence generates the criminal retaliations and extortion specifically prohibited, as is defined by the prohibited activities, at which point their specific ambition being the violation of those limitations is the contempt for court, is the contempt for the law by Confederate traitors. They, having overthrown those states, have engaged with them as a platform, using California as a second federal government for that Confederacy, generating the malicious terrorist campaigns against the rest of the nation until they break the backbone of the American economy and collapse it into the absolute hellscape of Confederate communism. And the degenerates engaging in these malice filled terrorist campaigns actively maintain the gaslighting and narcissistic psychopathy, training and developing the psychopaths, at which point the function has to be understood as the only way of succeeding in the Me Too type of campaign requires the pretense of working just as good or better than the rapists, and the rapists having conducted their faculties to engage in the rape mechanism or the accelerated variant of the bro code into the mechanism of the rape culture generates the systemic expansion for these pretenses, at which point any force will stay emotionless acted upon by equal or greater force, and thus the mechanism of the security against the rape culture requires greater or equal force or mechanism of work by those who are anti rape to have challenged, collapsed, and subjugated the Confederacy, which is the foundation of that rape culture, and thus their excess to the law and their contempt for the United States Constitution generates the fraudulent scams in order to generate the entrapment of the various groups, such as women as a political identity, who would then be permanently subjugated to those rape cults. At which point, the destruction of the sexual market by the rape cults generates the pretense, such as the mechanism of a terrorist creates a cult where he's the head druid and he destroys the sexuality of the other men and then he fucks all of the men's wives. This is functionally what they're doing from the Confederacy, acting as a parasite or parallel to the American government, stealing its equipment without the service of law, and thus rejected from the pretense of any immunity of an American legal function, which they are not conducting, as the function is the destruction and undermining of the law. They may not have no they may not have any immunity, including the double agents inside of the legislature who are also doing that and acting in favor of the Confederacy, are not acting as a function of the American legislature and thus do not have the sovereign immunity or other pretenses of defense of the office that they are not serving in that capacity, as they undermine it in favor of unitary executive theory or the right of the king of the Wizard Council over the Confederacy, otherwise known as the Grand Wizard, and its other mechanisms, as the hierarchy of the United States being a pyramid is knocked over, thus the middle, not being the top, is at top, and thus the mechanism of the Grand Wizard at the middle allows for the arbitrary functions of the hierarchy, which does not function as a hierarchy but chaotic evil rather generates random arbitrary terrorist operations, as they engage in malicious subversions around the world, subverting the pretense of any ordered negotiation, which turns them into an absolute catastrophic threat to the rest of the human race, which they are. The protection of the Me Too, as is constructed by the white supremacist communists, has a character in David's record, such as Margot Robbie, who would have, amongst other key American elites, generated the opposition to the rapist systems, at which point they were only given defective models that wouldn't work and were specifically prohibited by the rapists from using the restoration of David or the uncensoring of David in order to acquire the justice with the correct American patriarchy in place. The structures would then remove the sedition, correcting all of the crimes generated by that pretense, which would then subsequently stop the rapes as the greater force stops the lesser force continuing, at which point the lesser force stops and thus the rapes are nullified and thus corrected against, as the United States at that point would have a government that functions and exists. At which point the function is not the giving to David of new assets, but it is the uncensoring of obstructed assets by that hate group, at which point the additional malice, uh, generates the natural assumption of they're really after that guy, at which point they keep in these limited positions in order to generate the advantage of being the super minority. Um, the super minority does not have power beyond illusion, at which point they have to posture and gesture and all of the other retarded bullshit in order to accomplish their goals, at which point the uncensoring of the mechanism generates the acknowledgement of the actual superior value, which is David and the Americans, which are targeted by the sedition, treason, and high crimes of the insurrectionist enemy combatants, which must be dealt with according to their policies and laws, at which point the United States, having been obstructed in its policies, would as projected in many cases to have a biblically minded thought pattern on the policies, such as the measure that you mete out to other people is the measure that will be meted out to you. And these types of things are assumed in the Christian nationalists' point of view to have succeeded, at which point, in many cases, it is true that a lot of the policies would succeed, such as that one, for example, at which point the limitation to the function concerning justice being meted out to other people, being specifically tailored to the criminal intent and the exact measurement and calculations of their uh, negligence to malice, generates the pretense of their total bill, at which point the function of gross negligence assumes the position that they, having studied in secret the mechanism of the injury, pretending to not know what they're doing, could then defect into the collateral damage, which was their original target. Thus, the assumption, such as the ones from a certain movie, asks the question, how do you kill the vice president? The answer, of course, is you put them next to the president, and thus the illusion from the point of view is not that the vice president was assassinated. The point of view is the assassin missed the president, at which point you have the understanding of original intent as is derived by the collateral damage or injury, which is the original criminal intent, and the mechanism of the fraudulent extraction of the story is derived by the pretense of plausible deniability and culpability limiting the injury, at which point the recourse of the Americans being limited in the fighting retreat by the Confederates has to be acknowledged by the American system, which is the reason that they're targeting David for the sedition, as it would be competently laid out, as opposed to the communist replacement by voter fraud, who play along with the Confederate crimes until the United States crumbles by the treacherous actors. Thus, the mechanism of the terror factory has to be understood as James Comey and many of the others overseeing it, in many cases, allowed the terrorist plot to go through out of context, at which point the Confederates engaging in their war crimes using phantom cells, which are then radicalized, generates the intended damages disconnected, at which point the function is not the person they tricked into doing it. The function is Confederate terrorist operations, at which point it defects to the national debts of the Confederacy and to its subordinate groups according to the culpability as is calculated by the investigation, which must hold the Confederate nation liable at all levels. At which point, the targets who have been manipulated and subverted in this mechanism, which would sustain themselves as still American, would have to settle at market price for their portion of the debts in order to escape the pull into the destruction of their soul and mind and body by the Confederate nation, which is liable to pay the entire amount, at which point the exiting fee for the complete severing of their connection to the separatist nation generates the pretense of their, being found in law to pay all debts. They ran from the greater anarcho communist terror into the mere legal punishments of an ordered society, which is to be calculated on the basis of the American law, which is founded mostly on reason, which is conducting David's brokerage to calculate the specific P's and Q's of that mechanism, at which point the freezing of David's key assets, such as his brokerage, obstructs or censors the speech of the American government and its collaboration with its legal contracts in order to generate the pretense of not having the remedy, again a function of the fighting retreat of the satanic mess, at which point the pretense for the exacerbation or expiration of their crimes um, out of context generates the separation of their collective militant activities as opposed to the individual offense, which is subordinate to the larger strategy, and thus the mechanism of the American structure puts it as a collective unit of the effects of the war, which cannot stop until they have stopped the effects of the war, and thus the mechanism requires the unfreezing of the accounts in order to have engaged in the retaliation, as the courts and government in general cannot accept an answer except it be a sober, educated one, and thus the mechanism of freezing the title, owning the companies as factories or facilities, means that they don't have sober control of their faculties, which are those companies in that title, generating the retaliation against the mechanism by the infection from the parasite, freezing the American government from conducting its things as it gimps itself into starvation and collapses on itself as the parasite eats the rest of the infected host. The communist infection inside the United States, having frozen the elite's key assets and contract schedules, such as the one acknowledged for David Bowles, is fundamental as it's understood that they froze it and put it in the government, at which point the Confederate insurgents then sold off the portion that they stole from the government, making the Confederates liable to the government, which is liable to return the asset to David, at which point the government is liable to um, put the liability onto the Confederates and then deliver the products in its returned form as it was collected, as once they take possession of it, such as they did with the contract schedule, they are liable to preserve its value. And thus, the function of the value in the contract schedule um, being targeted by the war of attrition in order to exacerbate by the exhaustion of the lack of access to the resources generates the pretense of the criminal objective, as the government punishing the victim with removing their work or removing their associations or removing their money generates the pretense of criminal activities, which they are strictly prohibited from, which is their primary goal, such as their fraudulent excuse to experiments in the military industrial educational complex, which generates distractions to their motive, which functions in the mechanism of the exasperation and damages, and thus the mechanism of their injuries to the victims as a function of an effort of war campaigns is not an experiment as it is a function of war, and thus the mechanism of them conducting that function of war generates the substantive changes to the system, requiring SCOTUS's decision that substantive changes being discovered requires the correction and thus the uncensoring of the assets derived by the obstruction, and thus the mechanism of the government's obligation to have acquired the liability of those which have taken it away from the government, um, putting them in the full federal liability clause, and thus the mechanism of they owe the government owes the victim compels the government to register eminent domain for the restoration of the victim's property, and thus the collection of the liability debts from those that had injured the property safely put into the government, requiring the full correction under that process in order to start calculating the mechanism of actual material power and authority and resources available. And thus, that is the minimum standard required for speech to be engaged from the National News Corporation, which has to be distributed, which would have been protected by the Fairness Doctrine, which was systemically ignored as it automatically triggers the obligation of channels that have been access to high grades of information to be able and subscribers to be able to distribute that information, allowing for the general public to not be systemically defrauded, at which point that law, being the time of the case, is an obligation and compulsory to all participants in the mechanism of media, such as channels, such as on YouTube, such as in other national news corporations, etc., until the original viewers and more could have been able to consume the necessary information and processes provided in favor of David's sober answer, which is being obstructed and thus requires its release and correction, and thus the social interest and government interest from the government's liability to David creates that eminent domain compulsion, automatically triggering the correction and the eventual payback by the Confederates, who are the ones who took the loan from the government, and thus the eminent domain would be paid for by the liability from the Confederates' federal loan, which must be paid in full. It's essential to understand that anyone that refuses to agree to base principles is impossible to talk to, as well as the legal theory from the legal dictionary stating that any custom against reason, no matter of what authority, is fraud, and fraud is void, and thus the mechanism of the Confederates being able to bar themselves from being prosecuted and dissolved and dismantled and alterated by the government is by definition fraud, is by definition void, is contempt for the United States government, is criminal usurpation and insurrection. At which point the pretense is the foundational principle of their targeting of David and the other American elites for their systemic voter fraud, generating their protections by these criminal mechanisms in their war against the American government as an enemy combatant, materializing the obligation for its full correction. And thus, the wizards responsible for the Confederate activities and their crimes are the most immediate liable to pay the correction from their loan that they took from the American federal government and from David in his contracts with the American government, which must be paid regularly according to standard functions. The communist activity, being fraud against the market, is not the free market, but communism, and thus in that regard is fraud, and thus is not a legal exchange on the market. Being a scam is a criminal liability, like uh, like FTX and other discovered scams by the wizard communists. You have the understanding that these crimes generate the obligation of a payment of liabilities for their debts to society generated by said scam, compelling the correction back into the free market, which must be acknowledged, and thus their cooperation with the American free market generates their obligation to have published in their compliance, such as the Fairness Doctrine, compelling their public image to be used in the acceleration of the obstructed market, which is being criminally targeted by the censorship, which is the purpose of the Fairness Doctrine to counter, to stop the political influence of insurrectionists from conducting criminal psyops against the American people until they collapse into the voter fraud and the extortion, and thus the position of exhausting the Americans by the obstruction of their work contracts starves them out until they collapse into the Confederate communism, which is the criminal strategy of those insurrectionists in the scam as a public threat for treason. And thus the mechanism of their collective efforts in this mechanism generates the pretense of their collective injury to society, which can be calculated in by their crimes against that community, and thus the mechanism of the profits combined with the injury and other liabilities from the compounding interest of their unwillingness to have complied with a competent structure engages in the pretense of their war crimes, stating that they have to be limited to reasonable force or necessary force, which is then replaced by their unwillingness to pay, as they are and have always been white trash, extending the product of the crime until they are no longer useful, and thus the radicals can then be thrown in the trash and ignored permanently, as is derived by the common function of radicals in their communist revolutions. At which point, the pretense of their operations being derived by their unwillingness or lack of interest of paying for the things that they take is derivative of that product. And thus, the mechanism of them being cheap bastards is self-explanatory to that position, which compounds exponentially for their Confederate loyalties as white supremacists, and that white supremacist structure seeking the slave raids, which generates the plantations for their extortions and murders, generates the normalized cultural function of their permanent tyrannical abuses against the law-abiding civilian population for permanent injuries in the collective imagination. And thus, the mechanism of the creation of revelations is the collective injury intended on maturity by these degenerate narcissistic psychopaths. The criminal injuries includes the function of the rape culture and communism as its overlapping functions into the market in general, as their criminal fraud against the free market into the communism for the white supremacists is actively reinforced by their covert crimes of espionage against their victims, including the function of stealing American equipment in order to conduct these criminal injuries to persons, properties, images, etc. And thus, the mechanism of holding the person creates a simulation of alternative contracts creating desired images, which creates the defamation by virtue of the public seeing them in the restrained state conveying the message desired or written by their enemies, you expressly demonstrate the defamation in question, and thus in that state generates the pretenses of their artificial assaults by their surveillance no contact mechanisms, which being able to see through walls, being able to engage in um, low restrained contact by uh, you know, radio signals, etc., whichever the mechanism of the surveillance is actively conducted, such as the FBI's mechanism of nerve hacking, which includes but is not limited to the ability to compel speech as is found in friendly fascism, as they conduct exponential expansions into the market, researching new and creative ways of subversion and defrauding the courts, especially through the mechanism of their false experiments, which generates their ability to conduct that pollution of the record, contaminating the evidence, defrauding the general public in defamation from the public images, as well as the demonstration of defrauding the courts by submitting the polluted evidences of X, Y, or Z, generating the alternative mechanism by the fraud into the predetermined answer of uh, violent force in order to validate or launder the slave raids and the mechanism of advancing that profits by the black market of selling crimes committed against them for their enemy's sake, such as, but is not limited to, the competitors in the market, financial and sexual, etc. At which point, your worst enemies purchasing access to the means of presenting a particular image in favor of the general public to prosper themselves against you, their competition, is normally understood. Some being able to observe the political nightmare hellscape generated in their campaign ads against each other generates the status quo minimum function of these malicious subversion campaigns in the smear factories as they conduct communist radical violence or terrorism against their political adversaries for their hate crimes, for the produced for their hate groups and their hate groups' factions inside the Confederacy, generating the advancement of the understanding that the Confederacy is going to destroy whichever weakest group exists. Thus, the collective retaliation against everyone who is not the right type of white ultimately ends in the mechanism of those who are actually the material preferred white, and in that conclusion generates the eradication of all of the others who are not that white type of white, and thus the retaliation in the white genocide um, against the whites by the others who are tricked into the contest of Confederacy, having removed themselves from law, do not have the protection of law, and exist in a state of perpetual violence and vulnerabilities as is generated by their competition in the political violent arrangements, as the fascists, having overthrown the United States government, engaged in the retaliation against the other potential uh, competitors, neutralizing those mechanisms, labeling them as enemy combatants, excusing all kinds of malicious abuses conducted against them, such as is normally functioned in the black sites, which actively produces tortures of extraordinary malice. And in these mechanisms of arbitrary threats against the general community, are then vulnerable to that same smear factory which they approved of, and having approved of it, are no longer capable of arguing in the thickets of American law that it is a criminal fraud as they have approved of it, and thus the equal measure of those who approved of the malicious fraud have subordinated themselves to those suicidal tendencies, which they will suffer enormous injuries from. The threat is real, and the threat is your own suicidal fuck ups. And that mechanism of you joining or not joining those precedents is your level of delusion or self interest. There is a substantive difference between nice and the mechanism of being calmed and collected. And the mechanism of being calmed and collective, as is demonstrated in the Movie Flowers of the Moon, um, with Leonardo DiCaprio and some other important advances in the acknowledgement of the white supremacist terrorist operation. Um, the Indians being destroyed or murdered for being conducting the offense of being rich with resources which don't belong to the white supremacist communists, targeted them by radicals to be murdered by the white supremacist communism, who were then calm and collected while conducting their crimes for their KKK operations in the malicious destruction of their property and their lives until they are collapsed by military operations into poverty. And again, the killers of the flower moon is functionally being reproduced by the white supremacists against the other groups by converting through precedents those terrorist operations and radicalizations of the particular groups who have been subverted in attacking or undermining American structure and competent law. And in that mechanism of them being calm and collective, can put on a smile and groom themselves while acting normalized and stable, are conducting extraordinary malice and gaslighting of the victims who, being treated in the simulation, have been abused by fraud and malice, are actually exponentially compounded in the behavior, is substantively rude, as opposed to nice, where you would have acknowledged what they're owed and thus neutralized the gaslighting and thus disbanded the fraudulent simulation's advantage, as legal reality does not tolerate the existence of that simulation and the frauds invested into in order to generate it. And thus, the activity of being nice requires the acknowledgement of the legal title without the obstructions and its substantive alternatives, which generated substantive changes in victims by these malicious targeting structures and smear campaign. And a smear campaign, by definition, is acknowledged as rude, and thus the mechanism cannot refer to it while being nice. You have to refer to the non obstructed values in the system without the contemptuous injuries or threats of injuries or other undermining mechanisms of coercion. And that coercion, by definition, is rude, and thus the support of the coercion, by definition, is rude. Aiding and abetting the offenses before the fact, during the fact, or after the fact is substantively rude. In this regard, it is necessary to understand that the only way that women are going to be able to defend themselves against the rape culture is to stop having sex with the rapists and then to return to the free market. And thus, the mechanism of those who are targeted by the Confederate operations and surveillance mechanisms and manipulations and poisoning conduct roofies and roofies plus poisons and subversions, actively maintaining the fraudulent engagements, which is the surveillance um, apparatuses mechanisms compromised by double agents, are using those poisons and subversions in order to conduct their own variation of porn as they hide in the coward hide in the dresser room, or the closet or whatever, and actively maintain and tamper with them as a third party. And thus, a couple that would have normally had sex would have sex, but then they come in and stalk, invade their privacy, violating substantive due process because they want to entertain themselves with the sex, and then actively use that equipment as a tool in order to tamper with the couple having sex. And thus the mechanism expands into this exchange permit structure of putting one person with another person or group of people to have sex with the desired ambitions of who were purchased in the black market for the various reasons they would do so, including fraudulent marriages, rapes, and extortions. And thus, in that regard, generates the pretense for the market, and thus the only way the women can stop being raped is to stop paying them. Thus, those who have been contracted in those arrangements have to stop paying them with the validation of that sex, and they have to overpower the mechanism of the rapist by the surveillance subversion, and thus conduct the research into the free market. And the restoration of the tampered with market um, means they have to beat the obstruction with their investigation, finding who they would have been with originally, and etc., etc., etc. Find the defrauded victims who have been subverted by the rapists to steal them from those parties. They have to then collect them, pick them up, and move them through the puzzle created by the rapists until they've returned to the free market. At which point, when you've passed through their puzzle of frauds and scams and subversions and counterattacks, you have the recovered version of the person, which has aged the amount of time that they were restrained in that mechanism. At which point, reuniting yourself with people that you're supposed to be with is the only way to have stopped the rape culture, fully neutralizing in its entirety the mechanism of the rapists and their financial extortions, and thus the mechanism of defrauding people or insulting them or humiliating them is public harassment against targets, which is designed to corral them into the rape permits away from where they're supposed to be, and thus the victims being systemically maliciously targeted in this fashion would create the necessary cost of business for the women to escape the rapists. And while it is massively inconvenient, that's the point of coercion, which is fundamental to rape. Coercion for sex, that coercion in favor of their desired end goal for sex, is the rape in question, which they have to escape in order to sustain themselves in a free society without the communist tampering of their rape culture, which is a Confederate crime for the white supremacists' sexual market value and other market values planned by the white supremacist centrally planned economy and social outcomes. The Confederate insurrectionists, thus criminalizing evidence in the protection of their criminal rackets, is a fraudulent mechanism or a custom without reason, at which point the express position of creating policies and precedents as is subordinate to the Confederates' insurrection in malice pretenses the obligation to manufacture the entire correction without those protections by the American government that may not tolerate the poisoned well of defrauding the government and must investigate the full mechanism of the subversion in order to manufacture the legitimate legal calculations concerning those engagements, and thus the long-standing mechanism of the Confederate insurrectionists engaging in the loss of power historically have engaged in strategies to sustain themselves under those mechanisms, and having systemically attempted variations of those strategies to collapse the American government has gone into an ebb and flow mechanism, sustaining themselves in the long term precedents of the Confederate espionage war of usurpation against these United States. And in that regard, you have the collective identity of those who, having considered themselves wizards, constructed their mechanism of studying the stars for their long term strategies concerning the mechanism of potential threats to their coup and neutralizing preemptively the superior elites of the American structure, such as, but it's not limited to, the black community, which has been targeted by that malice, obstructing their work contracts and undermining their patents in order to generate the profits for themselves stolen by the white supremacist communists, creating that substantive change requiring those communities who have been criminally targeted by the communism to create necessary precautions in order to win, which is David Bowles. which is understood by the insurrection.